true that kids are very well supervised in real life, like parents are very on top of them and there's a lot of structure, but there's a lot of not good supervision in the web. Leaving it up to the parents and the kids alone is a mistake, because at the end of the day, the platforms have another agenda. So I do feel like there's a need to regulate the platforms. People that post a lot, are you really showing who you really are, or are you creating a persona that is going to get more likes and more shares?
This is the Transformational Life Consulting Podcast with Deepa Grandin, MD, where Christians like you get the practical support and tools you need to build your spiritual, mental, and physical well-being, and to guide you on your journey to health and wholeness based on evidence-based science and God's Word. I am your host, Dr. Deepa Grandin.
Thank you to all our regular listeners for taking the time to listen to yet another episode of Time to Transform. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our first-time listeners. We hope you find the information provided useful and will continue to make Time to Transform part of your spiritual health and wellness journey. All right, so let's get to today's podcast. Today, I want to address a very important topic on the impact of overuse of electronics on the mental health of children and adolescents. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist and best-selling author of the book The Anxious Generation, highlights how the rapid expansion of electronic devices, smartphones, tablets, computers, gaming consoles, all of these have fundamentally reshaped the daily lives of our children and adolescents, with mounting evidence linking excessive or problematic use to a spectrum of mental health concerns. Multiple U.S. states, school districts, and individual plaintiffs have filed lawsuits against major social media companies like Meta, TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, alleging that these platforms have contributed to the mental health crisis among children and adolescents. Now, when we look at these lawsuits, typically what they're claiming is that social media companies have designed their platforms to be addictive and have failed to put protective measures for young users from harmful content, leading to increased rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and other mental health problems, especially in the youth. So let me give you an example. In 2023, over 40 state attorney general jointly sued Meta, accusing it of knowingly endangering children's mental health through its product design and marketing practices. School districts in several states have also initiated legal action seeking compensation for the costs of addressing student mental health issues linked to social media use. Now, these legal efforts reflect a growing public health concern, and it calls for accountability as highlighted by the U.S. Surgeon General and professional organizations in the medical literature, which emphasizes the need for industry, policymakers, and researchers to address the risks posed by social media to youth mental health. Now, what we're seeing really is a high and increasing trajectory of addictive screen time, especially involving social media, video games. And unfortunately, these are directly correlated with elevated risk of suicidal behavior, depression, anxiety, and sometimes, these children are externalizing these mental problems and they translate into behavioral issues, attention problems. So when you associate disrupted sleep, the way it impacts the sleep-wake cycle, all of those seem to be contributing to some of these behavioral issues. How much device is being used before bedtime also seems to be impairing sleep quality, duration. So, it's not just about kids being absent from school, But there's something known as presenteeism, where kids go to school, but they're not able to focus because they haven't had enough sleep. And we know definitely the lack of sleep causes problems with emotional and behavioral problems. And it seems to be especially children who have a risk or already have some sort of pre-existing mental health issues, they actually seem to be more prone to engaging in excessive screen use. So it's like a vicious cycle. So as you can see, this is quite a deep topic, a lot to uncover. And it is impacting so many families all over the world. It's not just one or two countries. It's just about every country where there's access to electronics. We are seeing this impact on children and adults, young adults even. So to help us through this topic on the impact of the overuse of electronics and social media on mental health of children and adolescents, I am very fortunate to have Dr. Carol Vidal. She is an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Her area of expertise is child and adolescent psychiatry. Dr. Vidal earned her MD, PhD from Autonomous University of Barcelona, Faculty of Medicine in Barcelona, Spain, and an MPH from Drexel University in Philadelphia. She's also completed her residency in psychiatry at University of Maryland Medical System and a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of Maryland Medical System. Dr. Vidal, thank you so much for taking the time to do this podcast with us. Before we begin this discussion, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What sparked your interest in child and adolescent psychiatry, and what do you enjoy doing outside of work?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me in the podcast. I'm excited to talk about this topic, and I'm very happy that you invited me to come. About myself, I would say that I'm a mom of two teenage girls, and I'm originally from Barcelona. I grew up there and spent the majority of my lifetime there. And then I came here in 2006 for personal reasons. My husband's from Ohio. So what sparked my interest in child and adolescent psychiatry, I would say that I never really planned on being a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I just made choices along the way of things that I liked to do and that I was most interested in. And I initially was interested in biology when I was in high school, and then I ended up in medicine because there's high unemployment rate in Spain. So, I thought that maybe working in medicine would give me more chances of having a job. And then I went into psychiatry because during medical school, I liked the brain and the nervous system, but at the time, there wasn't a lot in neurology that you could do with the patients, and most of them were stroke patients. So I thought psychiatry would be more, there would be more diversity in the type of patients I would have, and I liked working with people. And then I had a really good experience with my mentor during my second residency in United States in psychiatry, and she was supervising a case of a teenage girl, and I just hadn't realized how much of our person lies in our development, and I really got interested in that. And it coincided that it was a time where I had just had my first baby, and I was really interested in how she changed from day to day. So I just thought that child psychiatry would be the way to go, and I'm really glad that I chose it. And then in terms of what I do on my free time, right now I drive my kids around a lot. Yes, and I go to the grocery store a lot on my free time, but I like spending time with my friends and my family. I like obviously traveling and reading, and I love outdoor sports and hiking, and I like music. So if I have free time to relax, sometimes I'll play an instrument very badly, but I try to do that or go to concerts. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the typical life of a mom, right?
Yes, not very special.
So let's start with the big picture. So from your perspective as a psychiatrist, how has childhood really changed since electronics and social media became part of daily life?
So I can talk a little bit about what it was like when I first started noticing changes in the patients that I was seeing. So I finished my fellowship in 2014, and up until that point, I hadn't really noticed anything related to social media or even electronics, other than some kids would just play more video games than others. And then I started as an attending at Hopkins, and I was working initially in the inpatient unit and the day hospital, which is a program where you go during the day and then you go home at night. And we started noticing that a lot of the kids that would come to the unit started coming because of reasons related to the phones. So it was, for example, you would get a kid that had for months been cyberbullied, which wasn't a thing up until that time because, you were bullied in school or not, but not cyberbullied, right?
Yeah.
And then they become depressed. Or maybe like I had several girls who maybe sent a nude picture to their boyfriend, and then the boyfriend distributed in their classroom, and everyone would see the picture, and then they obviously would have a meltdown. And apart from the embarrassment, they would disclose that they were having suicidal ideation related to the event, even when before that they hadn't had any problems. And we started seeing also like maybe some teenagers that would have inappropriate contact with an adult. And then the parents obviously would react by taking away the phone, at which point the kid would just have an episode of agitation, or maybe they would just start endorsing suicidal ideation, and then they would get admitted to the inpatient unit. So that was like my first contact with, the overlap with psychiatry and the phones. And that was really around the time when they became more popular, because around 2014 was when I finished my fellowship. And it's also when more kids started to get their phones, even at younger ages. And then I noticed also there was, especially in the day hospital, there were really quick changes in the culture. For example, all this gender spectrum was a new thing that I had not experienced before in the American culture, which was very, you have two genders and two sexes and stuff. So that changed very quickly around that time as well. So the adults were trying to adjust as fast as we could. And then I thought the pandemic was kind of a key time also, where there was even more use of digital media, obviously, because there were a lot of kids that stayed home for months. There were, at the time, is when TikTok became more popular. And in TikTok, it was very common to have groups of influencers that would talk about mental health. So we would get patients that would present with knowing all the criteria of the DSM about certain disorders. Like I had a patient who had comment, she could list a whole list of symptoms for bipolar disorder, but her functioning in life didn't really match the symptoms, right? Because she was highly functioning, she was getting good grades, she was attending school every day. So that was like a discrepancy with what she was saying, which was very well rehearsed. And I think it was learned from TikTok and what she was actually really presenting like. So at the time, there's also a boom of what we call TikTok tics, which was this presentation that some of the kids would learn online, and they would start presenting tics, but they were functional tics, which is basically not a real tic, but it's something that you provoke in a way. And that was noticed by outpatient providers that focused on Tourette's or tic disorders. And I think more recently, because it's become just so much part of the culture, I've been seeing more subtle problems like this just problematic use where people just can't stop using it and they don't even notice. More like learning unhealthy behaviors, like, for example, girls that might be interested in losing weight, and then they just go and they get into the algorithm of losing weight, and they end up, presenting behaviors that could be similar to what you have when you have an eating disorder, or people learning about self-harm behaviors, which is more concerning. And these social comparisons that girls do a lot online, because social media is perfect for that, right? Because you are always looking up to what other people are doing across the world. And there's, you're at an age where you're trying to do that as part of your development. So these are some of the things I saw as a clinician. I think obviously I do agree there's been with Jonathan Haidt and other people that study more population level changes, that there has been a change in childhood, and that obviously childhood now is more linked to use of technology than it would ever was before. And I think there's also a change. It's true that kids are very well supervised in real life. Like parents are very on top of them, and there's a lot of structure. They're sign up for sports and things like that, which is great. But there's a lot of not good supervision in the web. So I feel like there's this thing where people feel like they're supervising their kids, but they don't really know what's going on when they're going on social media. So I think that's another characteristic. So when you look at population level changes, what you see is that now kids are getting more in trouble for things that you would do at home. Like, so it was common that we would worry about kids using drugs and going out and getting into legal trouble or having disruptive behaviors outside. And now you're seeing actually that even though drug use is still a huge problem, and there's an increase in vaping, and there's an increasing concentration of cannabis of THC in cannabis, and there's been like the epidemic of fentanyl use and overdoses. I think the problem overall, there's less illicit drug use in kids, in young people. There's less legal problems, there's less disruptive behaviors. They get in trouble less for being outside. But there's more of the things that you would present when you're more isolated at home or more sedentary, or you're spending just more time by yourself, which is, depression, anxiety, sleep problems, like you were saying, and obesity. So, yeah, those are some of the things I've been seeing.
Yeah, because I remember when I was growing up, it was more in person, play with your family, play with friends next door, ride your bike. It was very different type of social interaction. My kids were born, my oldest was born in 2004, my youngest was born 2006. Now they're both in college. But just watching that whole generation of kids, parents just reaching out to me, a lot of them just feeling alone, and almost in panic mode because none of us had that type of mental health issues growing up. And since COVID, and it seemed to be predominant in preteen and teen girls, like the suicidal ideation, self-harm, eating disorder, and then this surge of diagnosis of ADHD and the number of kids that have been placed on ADHD treatment. It was quite fascinating. I was reading the study from South Korea that followed electronic usage over a 2-year period. And what they found was kids prior to the electronic usage and then with excessive usage over the 2-year period, their behavior could fit the DSM-5 description of ADHD. And it had a direct correlation with the quantity of the electronic usage. So, I think this mental health crisis that we're seeing with the younger generation has so much to do with how we lead our lives these days. And even when I talk to some of these parents and they're like, oh, if we take the phone away from our kid, it feels like we're putting them in social isolation because that's how they all connect with each other. That's how they're all talking about, hey, this is the game we're going to go watch, or this is where we're going to go for dinner on Friday night. And so even parents are put in such a tough spot. So are there like certain ages in your experience, say like middle school or high school, where kids seem to be especially vulnerable to screen time and social media pressure?
Yes. So in general, as a general rule, the younger the child, the less time on screens they should be spending. I wanted to just mention what you were saying about the parents being concerned about their kids being isolated if they don't have a phone. I think that's a really great point. And actually, there were some studies that actually showed that if you don't use your phone at all, your mental health is not necessarily better than if you use it in moderation. So a lot of the literature shows that maybe time spent alone doesn't really necessarily tell the whole story, because some people spend a lot of time on social media, but they also have a lot of friends in person. So there's a little bit of a mixed population conclusions that we're taking, that maybe if we looked at individuals over time, they might give us different answers. So there's still a lot of research out there to look at. But going back to what you were saying, yes. So the general norm is if you're younger, you want to spend less time. And actually, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that below the age of 2, you would not use screens at all. They're not educational, and it's better to learn with hands-on approaches and interacting with parents and family members or other kids. And they recommend to limit it just to maybe, if you have to make a call to a family member who lives away and you want to Skype with them or do a video call, but otherwise they recommend not to use it. And then even in toddler years, there's no real reason. You may introduce some screens for educational purposes, but really the better, the more advantage you can take of these platforms or in general of technology is the older you are. So once you've sort of like developed more as a person, then that's when maybe you can have more benefits than the problems that may ensue from using them. Remember that before the pandemic, we had a 2-hour limit as a recommendation from the AAP in terms of screens in general, even just for TV. But during the pandemic, that sort of like went away because we had to use screens for educational purposes, right? Like the kids were 6 hours in front of the computer doing online education, and that was really hard to like set a limit of 2 hours. And outside of that, they were also staying home, so they also had to communicate with other peers through social media. And I was very anti-phones and everything, but I felt like my kids were really isolated and it was impacting their mood. So I got them a phone during the pandemic so that they could communicate with their friends and make plans and, even like play these video games that are now like social video games where you can play with other people. And that was their way of playing at the time.
Yeah. So just going back to the question, like, are there certain ages like middle school or high school where kids seem especially vulnerable to screen time? I know you mentioned like the toddler and the really young kids, but especially like with that prestige image, that comes across social media, the pressures that come across. And you were talking about how some of the girls get pressured almost into a certain type of physical conformity. Can you talk a little bit more about that age group where they seem to be especially vulnerable to those really subliminal messaging that comes across?
I mean, I think that I think the middle school years are pretty intense in that way. Not only you're trying to figure out who you are, but also that happens in high school, obviously. But when you're a middle schooler, you really don't have the emotional ability you just haven't learned enough to like know, make a distinction of, even like be critical about how people are presenting themselves online and the filters they're using. They might know about filters, but when they see the image of someone selling makeup, and it's a time where also they feel insecure. They don't really know who they are. They're trying to figure it out with other people. So they might be more sensitive to all these social impressions that they might get from other people. And in this case, the power of social media really is that you have peers showing you and telling you what to do. And when you're a teenager, you're more oriented to your peers than you are to adults. So it doesn't really matter that much what your parents are telling you. I mean,
exactly.
At the end of the day, what the peers or even like, people you might not know on social media, but you see them every day because they have videos every day. Those are the ones that are going to probably influence you more than anyone else. So
yeah,
that's why some of the recommendations, actually, there's a website called Wait Until 8th, where they recommend to wait until 8th grade to purchase a smartphone. And with the idea that like parents in a group of friends, I think if you have a group of kids that are friends and their parents agree on delaying the purchase of the smartphone, then that gives them a chance to learn to socialize without the smartphone, and no one is left alone. Like no one is left marginalized because they didn't find out about what the plans are. So that the group of parents pledges to wait until they're 14 to buy a smartphone, which I think is a good option.
Yeah, I really like how you mentioned that cutoff, right? Or at least that age of 14, because there was this Japanese study that looked at how the child's brain can identify with the culture that it's in. For instance, the Japanese kids that grew up, say, from 9 to 14 years of age in California and then returned to Japan, they had a harder time adjusting back to the Japanese culture. But if they came younger than the age of 14, it was easier for them to adjust back. So there's something about that cutoff of 14 where the identity of the individual is a little bit more consolidated. And so when you have this child growing up in this social media and culture and environment where it's not really where they feel safe, right? So they grow up as like this very anxious person, always in defense mode. And that kind of works against them, even when they go to college or trying to explore relationships, trying to explore jobs in the next phase of their lives. They're always in defense mode. So yeah, and you know, there were also very scary documentaries that have come out of this 10-year-old girl who was hooked on pornography at the age of 10. And her mom was like a helicopter mom. She was always making sure she ate all her vegetables, was always next door, protecting her from the external real world when the predators were online. And there were no, like, you know, you had pointed out before, there were no real monitoring going on the online world, the virtual world that kids are involved in. So having that healthy balance, and then after the age of 14, you know, introducing ways where they can even socialize, but still have those safeguards where parents are still knowing what exactly are my kids getting involved in.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So we are seeing rising rates of anxiety and depression among young people. And how much do you think is actually connected to social media?
So yes, that is true. We've seen increase in depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts and behaviors among youth for several decades. Starting early 2000s, it became really obvious. I have to say this increase is more prevalent among girls also, but girls in general, they present more depression and disclose more depression and anxiety. They also have more suicidal ideation and more suicide attempts, although they tend to die by suicide less than boys. I just wanted to clarify that. And that the main cause of suicide is always depression. If you have a mental health disorder and if you use substances, those are like very big risk factors for suicide. But I think that, you know, it is hard sometimes to just pinpoint one change in society, right? Like social media is one thing of all the technological changes that we've experienced over the last few years. It has happened so quickly that we don't even realize, right? Like, you know, I think the smartphone was like a really big in change in the way we live, but we don't even notice the advantages of having a smartphone. Like, for example, yesterday I was at a soccer game with my daughter, and while I was waiting, I was able to connect with my siblings, my sister and my brother, who were in different homes in Barcelona, right? So that's like a pretty amazing thing, and we don't use paper maps anymore. So there's definitely a lot of advantages. I think there's also the reality that we are sort of like, I heard someone give a speech at a university, and she talked about how we're like feeling closer to people that are far away sometimes with the technology than the more, and not as present with people who are, you know, with us and close to us. The challenge with these apps of social media is that, well, we have the smartphone, but then you download all these apps that are social media apps. And that is that, as opposed to, for example, when I use a Guitar Tuner, which is an app I buy and I subscribe to that app, and then if I don't use it, the company has already make the money. With social media, they make money the more time you're engaged on the platform, right? So the only way for them to, I mean, their revenue comes from ads, and so their purpose is to have you engage the more the better for them, right? And that for children can be a problem, because usually we have safeguards for children, but these platforms haven't necessarily put the safeguards, or at least not proactively. So I think that is a problem. But in general, about whether social media is the cause of this increase in depression and anxiety, there's two schools of thought. One is obviously, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt, and in his book, The Anxious Generation, he talks about that. There's also a sociologist, her name is Jean Twenge, and she's written books about generational differences. She wrote a book called iGen that was really good, and has written one called Generations. And she basically looks at population level data, and she says that starting in 2012, which is when the smartphone became very popular, there's a drastic increase in depression and anxiety, and it's most obvious among girls. I think that against this hypothesis, I would say is that the increases were happening already before 2012, so there must be other things. And it is also a little bit hard. Sometimes clinicians have a harder time with this hypothesis, because when we see a patient, we see that maybe they're using social media, but then they're also maybe having being exposed to violence, or being abused by their parents, or being struggling to make it to the end of the month with food in the refrigerator. So I think there's like so many different factors. There's economic changes that have happened. There's income inequality that has increased over the last few years as well, in the United States especially. So there could be many potential causes, but I don't think this is a bad theory. I just think that it's probably more complex than that. Then the other school of thought is other researchers like Dr. Rich from Harvard. They postulate that screens only can't be the cause, and that there's other things like the things I was mentioning, like workforce or market changes, or not necessarily, they don't mention necessarily those, but that could be also potentially causes. And I think against this theory is that when there's been studies that have been looking at whether if you decrease your time on social media, or you have a period of abstinence of using phones, you improve your mood or not, and they show that it's actually beneficial. So the groups that decide to, if you're like put on a group where you have abstinence, you do better in terms of your wellness measures than if you're put on a group where you continue using the same. And there's actually a meta-analysis showing that as well. So I think, especially if it's more than a week. So there was a meta-analysis that was done that showed that did not happen in a week. But if you waited 2 weeks, which we did the meta-analysis with a 2-week period, and then you could see that there was an effect. So if you spend about 2 weeks, it's supposed to help you. I think it is complex, but there's more now, and a lot of the studies are cross-sectional. So you take a sample of people with high use of social media, they tend to be more depressed, and that's for sure. But we don't know if they were depressed and then they started using social media, or if they had other reasons to use social media. So it's complex. It could be going both ways. But now there's more evidence that actually there's some longitudinal association as well. I don't know if you know about the ABCD study. It's a national study that measures, has a lot of measures on mental health and substance use. And they follow children from the age of 9 and 10. I think the last cohort has, they're 15, 16 years old. And when they look at how much time you spend on social media at baseline, and how much depression you have at a later point, they see that there's a relationship. So it seems like more time at baseline predicts more depression later on, which I think that's a good study. And then there's also some meta-analysis supporting these findings as well longitudinally. So I think there's probably evidence that there is something there. I think it's complex too, because sometimes, like I was saying earlier, you could be mixing people who already have psychopathology and problem socializing, or maybe temperamental differences, and you're mixing them with people, and they may not be using social media. And at a population level, you may be mixing them with people that are using a lot of social media, but they're also very healthy. So it's a little bit complex, and I think we need more studies, definitely. And then we need to understand how you use social media, how that impacts, it's not just about the time you're spending on social media. Are you going on social media just to connect with your friends? Or are you going because you're, spending hours on pornography, or searching for ways to hurt yourself, or things like that? My personal position is that social media is going to be here for a while. I mean, I don't think we're going to not have social media. it can have positives, I think, for some kids. But overall, like you want to do things in moderation and maintain a good health overall, as for with everything that you use. If you overeat, you're also going to have trouble. If you overexercise, it's the same. So I have the same approach with social media. But I think that leaving it up to the parents and the kids alone is a mistake, because at the end of the day, the platforms have another agenda. So I do feel like there's a need to regulate the platforms, because like you mentioned, some parents, I myself don't know what's going on with my kids. It's just really hard to monitor when they're away in school or walking to school. I don't know what they're doing with their phones. It's complicated. So I do believe that we need to regulate. And I think that with AI, we're going to encounter the same type of problems. There's already a case of this kid that in his parents' eyes, he was doing fine, but then he got he was chatting with ChatGPT, I think it was, and ended up dying by suicide, because he had been researching tools on how to effectively die, and then basically the robot was encouraging him even. So I think a lot of what's happening too is there's this litigation process that's happening that's maybe going a little faster than the regulation from the government. But I do think that there needs to be safeguards, because we have enough of a signal to show that this mental health crisis probably has something to do with the technological changes. And even though we need much more research to understand it better, I think there's enough to show that we could be being more proactive about it.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely, research. A lot of times it takes 10 years for it to catch up with what we see as clinicians. And so you're seeing and your colleagues are seeing, which you would see much early on, and even listening to what parents are saying, right? Because I have friends or family that say, my kid I know has an issue with, even if it's a gaming platform or just problematic use of their phone. I remove the phone. They go to camp where electronics are not allowed, and they come back as they know their child to be, and then they get back on their phones and they see this different person, right? So when you know a child so well, whether you're the pediatrician, the psychiatrist, the parent, teachers, they're all saying very similar things. In fact, I'd recently given a talk at a school, and I had heads of department, especially at the lower grades, like kindergarten and first grade. They're like, oh my gosh, we don't know what's going on, but we have such a hard time getting kids to focus in school. Like their attention has gotten so bad. And then I have parents that come and they're like, they are being bullied by their kids and manipulated about how long they can keep their devices, or, you have that thing going on, which you would see with an addict, right? Because addicts would do anything to keep the addiction going and to justify what they're doing. And that's unfortunately like some of that behavior that parents are seeing and teachers are seeing. And that's, something that I've been being aware of as well. So when we are talking about parents and, especially when we're talking about focus and attention, do we know how the constant screen use can affect attention and learning and that kind of thing?
Yes. So first of all, I wanted to say that I totally agree with you about this idea that we see things and then we're like waiting for this randomized control trial, which is really difficult, and in order to do things. And I am all for, in a way, what the parents are saying, what the schools are saying is qualitative data. We do qualitative data research all the time, and that it's important, their perceptions and what they see in their kids. And if they see a qualitative difference between the child with the phone and without, it's probably for a reason. And the perfect example are the school bans for phones. I'm completely in support of those bans, and they make a huge difference in the climate of the school. The administrators are saying it, the teachers are saying it. They're sort of like the ones bringing it up. So I think we should listen to the people that are there, seeing the kids 6 hours a day at least, right? But in terms of the attention, so the attention is a very complex construct because it's a lot of different things happening in the brain. But even when we talked about ADHD back in the day, before smartphones and social media, we talked about there being a threshold for attention, right? So there's a threshold, like a level at which you have a stimuli and then you react and pay attention to the stimuli, right? So when you're constantly stimulated, highly stimulated with things that are very powerful in terms of all your stimuli, like visual and acoustic, like everything going on when you're looking at screens, you sort of like your threshold increases. So it's harder for you to get stimulated and focused with stimuli that are not so strong. Like, for example, a math problem. And then also math problems are more, it's more boring to do a math problem than it is to just watch a mindless TikTok video that lasts 20 seconds or a minute at the most. So there is already theory behind that, that if you are exposed to a lot of video gaming and a lot of TV or early on in your life, then you might have more trouble focusing with more boring tasks, basically.
Yeah.
And even there's some studies that show that the engagement that you have with another person that you're talking to changes if there's even just a phone on the table, just so that even if you're not checking your phone, just the fact that there's a phone on the table is distracting and you do worse. So I definitely think that even without this, a lot of the phone bans, for example, happened in 2024, so we don't really have enough data. But just by talking to people, you can see that when they have a phone ban, it worked, and they keep expanding because they're working. So I think, definitely has an effect on attention.
Yeah. I can totally see how that overstimulation, but like you were saying, the lights, the sounds, and then trying to do something so mundane as math, where you really need to focus and stimulate certain parts of your brain in order to do that activity. It kind of is not used a lot, right? And I think also they find that kids that learn instruments, because it takes focus, and it's almost like learning a new language when you learn to read music, and they also tend to be better in math. So it's really dependent on what are you teaching your kids, what part of their brains to use, and that also translates into how they do in school. When we talk about adolescents, and they're always talking about who am I, they're trying to find their identity in the world. And now they're in this world of likes, followers, endless comparisons. How do you think that's shaping their self-esteem and identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of every developmental period in children has a task that you're supposed to complete before you move on to the next developmental period, right? So you start out like by focusing on attachment relationships with your parents, and then move on to peer relationships. And the task for adolescents is to try to find out who you are, like who are you really as a person, what's your identity, and that's a complex process. So I guess like you could be, you could think that maybe social media could be good in the sense that you have exposure to so many different things and so many different people that you have more of a choice to choose who you are. And that might be the case for certain minorities that may not have people around them that think like them or look like them. So in a way, it opens up possibilities, and you can compare yourself to people that you don't have around you in your community. I think the downside, though, is that these comparisons tend to be superficial. So you focus on one aspect of the person and not the whole person. The person as an entity that's very complex, and that is a risk. I think people create also personas online that really don't reflect the reality of who they really are. So that then you're being exposed to people that are just showing what's most shiny about them, or like what's gonna get likes. So for the kids that are seeing it, that it's not real, and it's not the reality of what a person is like. And then also maybe for the people that post a lot, are you really showing who you really are, or are you creating a persona that is going to get more likes and more shares, and then you're not really yourself. So there's like this gap that gets created between who you really are and who you are showing yourself as to the world that can sometimes get confused. You can get confused as a person about who you really are. So in that sense, you would not be developing your identity better, if you did that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think you can use research. You can use like social media as a research tool to see who you want to be, but there's a chance that you'll find that the content is not real. It's just what people are showing to the world, but I'm not sure that's really how you want to develop your identity.
Sure. Yeah. Because when we were growing up, we had real role models and people that we could emulate, like you're saying, the whole persona. Like right now, you have the Kardashians or Paris Hilton. I mean, they all have this persona of who they want the world to think they are.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows them in depth as, what they really are.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, how does online friendships compare to in-person friendships? Because, some kids are really connecting in person, but not in person all the time. And I'm sure this type of friendship comes at a cost. What do you think?
Well, I think about what you said, we've always had like celebrities that as a teenager, you always looked up to celebrities. I think that right now the difference is the intensity with how they are exposed to these influencers, but also that the influencers are their age. So sometimes it's even easier to feel like you can be like them, right? But in terms of like in-person interactions, I think they just allow you to see the real person. So like you might see them, their flaws and their strengths in a more comprehensive way. You can read their facial expressions. You don't hide your body language when you're with another person in person. And you can also, it's harder to avoid uncomfortable situations. So it sort of like helps you learn how to figure out relationships without ending the relationship, which in social media, I feel like it's very common that we just like block the person or be super mean without any consequence. And the other person on the other side is like, oh my God, like what's going on here?
Yeah.
So I think it's just not, I mean, you can still have those relationships, but they're not relationships where you learn to be better at relationships when you're online, for sure. And I guess it's better to have some interactions than no interactions at all. But I do think that in-person interactions would still be better. I mean, it's also nice, sometimes you can stay connected with friends when you're away and potentially maintain the relationships. But I think that can also backfire because it makes you think that you're having this really strong relationship and then maybe you're not really maintaining contact in person with that other person. So I think it's very different to have in-person versus virtual relationships.
Yeah, because as a lifestyle coach, one of the pillars that we teach is that the community, right? Creating community and social connections, how important it's for the social brain, because it's almost like exercising that part of your brain, like you were pointing out. Like, how do you deal with conflicts without burning bridges, right? And with these types of social or online personas, it's a very different interaction. Because loneliness now, it's like a huge cardiac health risk. And yes, is that social connection online a good substitute? I wouldn't think so. I think it comes back to that, how much of a substitute is ultra processed foods versus God-made natural foods, right? So it's like so hard to compare that online relationship with the in-person relationship. And yes, especially when you're living in different countries, your family and friends so far away, that's a great way to connect and keep in touch. But having those day-to-day in-person interactions are also so crucial for a person's physical and mental well-being. So just to transition, like the next point, like the sleep, the exercise, eating habits, we are being shaped by the things we see on social media. How are those basics like sleep, exercise, eating habits, relaxation being shaped by electronics and late night scrolling?
think actually the sleep problems. I mean, the exercise obviously is important, and with especially with increase in rates of obesity, and it's good for your mental health. But I think right now we have most evidence for sleep. Sleep is really impacted by social media, and actually we did a study where I didn't conduct it, but I was part of it, where they basically had consensus from experts from around the world, and they found that the most evidence is for sleep impacting people who use a lot of social media. And I think it's not just because of the blue light, which is the screens have this blue light that keeps you awake and makes your brain think that it's still daylight. But I think it's also, people tend to use it at night when it's hard to make decisions about when to stop, and you just start scrolling and it's really difficult to stop yourself, as opposed to in the morning where you're more rested. And then the other thing is that sleep affects really all of the mental health problems. And then also it impacts your attention. So if you're not sleeping well, the chances of you having other mental health problems are very high.
Yeah. I think those are great points, because the American Pediatric Association came up with the timeline or quantity of time that children of different age groups, what's considered realistic, what's considered healthy. Can you go into a little bit about screen time? What is a realistic strategy that we can give our patients, our parents, to set those healthy boundaries?
I think that one of the things that is easiest to do is to just take breaks every once in a while, because then you realize how well you're doing, and your family around you realizes how much better you are without the phone, and that motivates you to take another break, which is a strategy that people use sometimes for all sorts of addictions. I would say for parents, so the issue with time, like I was saying, is that time alone may not be as correlated with things, although there's some evidence that it is. But if you have a lot of people using social media a lot of time, what happens is that you have more chances of having more people who have problematic internet use or problematic social media use, which is the people that basically behave as if it was an addiction, where it's really hard to stop yourself. And so, yeah, I think that decreasing the amount of time obviously is a good approach. And one way to do it is the buying of the smartphone for your child. And like I said, that delaying it until 8th grade is a great idea. It could be like a present for a graduation after 8th grade. And then be also very clear about the rules of smartphone use before you buy the smartphone. And I think for parents too, being a good role model on their use of smartphones is important, because if you're telling your kid not to use a phone, but you're all the time on your phone, it's kind of hard to make a case of why it's bad. So that's always a good thing. I think setting screen limits from the beginning, as a parent, there's ways that you can set screen limits for your children if you have them in their family plan. And that, I think, should happen before giving the smartphone out, so that they know what they can get, but they don't know what they could access a lot more stuff, And then also having like free phone spaces in the house is a good thing. Some people have the kitchen, definitely the room. It's a good way for them to not spend those extra hour, 2 hours before bedtime. There's boxes that people sell to put in and lock your phone. So as a family, sometimes people go in and put all the phones of the family when they get in the house, and then they just lock it, and then they get it back at 7 a.m. or something like that. Having phone-free meals, free days during the weekend where no one in the family uses the phone, or you can like go for walks without a phone. And then I don't know if you know about it, but there's this American Academy of Pediatrics family media plan, where you can go on the website and then you enter the information about each member of the family and how they use their phone, and it gives you recommendations on what to do. So that's an excellent tool. I think it's really good. Yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah. So everyone, let's say you have a parent who's maybe spending a lot of time playing video games on the phone, they'll give suggestions, and different from the child who maybe is connecting with friends all day long. And then so they give suggestions on what to do for each member, and then stuff that you can do as a family. So I think that's a really great tool.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll definitely get that information from you and put it in the show notes so families can use it. But I do love all those ideas. And I also know families that have used screen free time, such as eating together as a family. Or if they have a family get together, they have friends coming for dinner, no screen time, then you have to interact with people face to face. So, yeah, such great tips. Thank you so much for sharing those. And what are some red flags or signs that a child's screen use might be slipping into something harmful or addicting?
I mean, I think any drastic changes in behavior or mood, like you should definitely look and see what's going on with the phone use, like severe isolation, or maybe some behaviors, like for example, you're seeing your child late at night on the phone in their room, or they're going to bed late because they're just spending, the light goes off really late because they're spending too much time on the phone. And then they get up late and they might be missing some school or being late to school. That's another red flag. If you can check if they have the power to purchase online, like see what they're buying online as well. And I think an expectation should be for them to share some of the information with the kids, with the parents. So like it could be, like you can have access as a reward to the phone, but as a condition, I need to know what's going on. And every once in a while, you're going to have to let me look, or I can have your password, something like that. But I think one of the things that I hope parents use is that, like, asking the child to show them their feed. Like when they get on TikTok, what are the main videos that are popping up? Because that really is information for you as a parent. It tells you what your child is interested in. If you go in and you see, I don't know, soccer videos and how to get better at soccer, you may not be as worried. But if you go in and you're like looking at only websites about how to lose weight or how to lose 10 pounds in 3 days or something like that, then you should be worried. So I think the content, there's ways to use it for your own benefit, because you can see the algorithms where they got the kid. And that's because that person had an interest in that content. So I think it could be a tool for the parents to know more.
Yeah, that's good. Good to know. So if you could give families and schools one piece of advice for helping kids build resilience in a digital world, what would that be?
I mean, I think for the parents, I think it's good sometimes to be able to walk them through the process of learning how to use it in a healthy way. It's going to be hard to have the kids not have any access. Eventually, they will have access, and then you may have those conversations before. I think for schools, I think it would be good. I definitely am for these bans. I really think that school time should be sacred in the sense that it's a time for learning, and phones are not really something you're going to need while you're learning from your teachers and with other peers. But I do think there's more of a need for like social media literacy in schools so that kids learn how to use it in healthy ways, but also how they learn to distinguish like good from misleading news and information that's now, especially with AI, that is made up, or it's like I think we need to catch up with the technology because we don't know enough of how it's affecting us, but also how to even read it or understand what's going on. So I think that the social media literacy, and just in general digital media literacy, is very important.
Okay. Yeah, I think those are really excellent points. So before we conclude, Dr. Vidal, thank you again so much for your great input and sharing so much with us. You had spoken to me a little bit about your book and would love to know more about it. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Where can people find your book?
Yeah, I wrote a book that was published in December in 2024 that talks a little bit about the things that I've talked about today, but it's not exclusively on social media. So it's more focused on the social comparisons aspect of social media and how it's changing in the new generations. It's called status and social comparisons among adolescents, popularity in the age of social media, and you can find it on Amazon. It's more like a text-like book, so I don't recommend it for the beach, but a beach reading. But if people are interested in like learning more about the research behind all these things, it's a good thing. The main focus is on social status and how it's really innate to human beings to try to find their place in the social ladder. And I focus more specifically on adolescents and children, as opposed to other work that has focused just in general on adults. And I also talk about the relationships with mental health.
No, I think that's actually a very important topic because even with the social media, that's something they really hone in on is that prestige factor, right? Because I think one of the social attraction for children is to identify with people who have social recognition and that status that you're talking about. So learning to know what's a healthy way of finding your role models and things like that would be very helpful for people's mental health. So thank you, Dr. Vital. We truly appreciate your expertise. We truly appreciate your time. And we look forward to seeing you in future events. Okay?
Thank you so much. This was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you.